to sit. But.
Thank you very much for that, Nathaniel. That was a great presentation. I'm sure there's going to be some areas that we'd like to dive into there. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Matt Burgess. I'm a senior editor at the UK edition of Wired magazine, and we've also got Clara here, who is well, you've got many, many hats, but these include being a technology policy fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, and you've got a history working within disinformation, misinformation, and government backgrounds as well. So over the next sort of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, want to go into a few areas that really is picking up on the question of transparency and sort of how these sort of campaigns are being managed and sort of dealt with. So I guess like as an opening statement from you both, it would be really good to hear where you think we are in terms of transparency within these campaigns and sort of the reporting upon them. If you want to start, Clara.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did also want to share that I have a twin sister, which is the most important thing you need to remember, because if I say anything that you disagree with, that actually came not from me, but from my deep fake. So my nickname for my twin is Deep Fake. Rachel, if you're watching, sorry to put the blame on you. So in terms of transparency, I think this is a really tricky problem that a number of platforms are struggling with. Because there is a struggle between a number of users understanding some of the national security aspects of why content is being taken down, and also why there might be reasons why you cannot actually share that with them. And so to give a couple of stories, I'll share my favorite one. When I was in US government, I served as the Chief Technology Officer of the Interagency Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, and we funded a project alongside Facebook called Peer-to-Peer. There was a student team that had created this incredible interactive game in which you could play and share with your peers symptoms of how someone might get radicalized. And maybe it could be things like if you're thinking about joining a white supremacist group, maybe someone is looking at Stormfront, right? And you see your classmate looking at that. So it was this fun game that was completely designed by students. They had curated the entire experience, interviewed a number of researchers. And the second that they launched it on the App Store, there was a New York Times article about it. It got taken down within 1 to 2 days. And they reached out to me and said, Clara, what do we do? We tried contacting the support store at Apple, and they couldn't do anything. And this is where transparency is also hurtful, not only to users, but also specifically to people that are looking to do counter-messaging. As if there isn't a clear set of guidelines, it really hurts a lot of people that are trying to help against counter-messaging online. And so I think some of the struggles that we've seen is really how do you think about removing contact while also notifying users? Should we use a strike system? I think Nathaniel can talk a little bit about that, when to notify users that their account might be suspended and for what reason, but also while not giving away the secret ingredients that might actually lead to more exploitation down the road.
I think, so first I should say that I feel like I should be rotating slowly so that everyone can see me as I'm talking, but then I might fall off my chair, so my apologies, I probably won't do that. I think that the platforms, by and large, are more transparent today about the work that we do than we've ever been before.
But that
there's a massive amount of work
too hard
to be done.
Yeah.
We need to do a lot better in terms of transparency is the real answer to that. I think one of the most challenging things that I've seen over the last year, we've had multiple cases where we have found mobbing and other techniques that were putting people at very serious risk. The problem was dealing with those threats also has constrained some of the tools that this community uses to conduct investigations. And it creates this incredibly difficult tension because from my perspective, the investigations that the open source community conducts are incredibly important. They are a really important balance and support for work that we do. They lead us to really critical investigations at times. But at the same time, if we're seeing people get targeted, if we're seeing people get exposed, in this case, we saw a company using scraping to identify users they suspected of being homosexual and provide that to governments that wanted to know this for sort of non-helpful reasons, as we might expect. When we see that type of thing being done, you have to close that loophole to protect those people. The problem is, the other thing that has to happen is building out more controlled mechanisms through API frameworks so that the legitimate investigators and researchers can still get access to this stuff. And that's one of the things we're working on now. We've spoken with some of you about this already, and that's partly why I'm saying I'd love to talk more with people about what the types of transparency are that would be most useful to you so that we can build those mechanisms.
And do you think anybody, other big platforms in particular, are doing something slightly different to what you're doing in terms of transparency? And is there anything you can learn from others?
Sure, I mean, if you think about the large platforms, the truth is they're all different environments and have different constraints. Twitter, for example, is able to post a lot more specific content from their takedowns. When we try to do that, large chunks of the content ends up being constrained by legal controls because Twitter is a largely public platform, exclusively so, and large parts of it, aren't public. And so one of the things we've had a number of conversations with some government partners and others on is, are there ways to change some of the legal frameworks to allow us to publish more of the content behind our takedowns? One of the things, the reason that our partnership with the DFR lab and increasingly with other investigators as well is so important is we have found that even if it's hard for us to publish the content of each takedown, when we do a takedown, we can talk to a particular trusted organization that will steward the privacy implications and so forth carefully, and they can conduct an independent assessment of it. That is a useful step in the right direction, but I'd much prefer to be able to put out more.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was actually going to ask in terms of, like, we have seen a lot of the cases when you have published information about inauthentic campaigns that you've taken down. The amount of detail that put out is very limited in terms of, you will say you've taken down 50 accounts that were Iranian conducted, for instance, or linked to Iran. But there's very little beyond that in terms of these are all the accounts, these are the posting. Is that the reason why, essentially?
So it's a combination of things. Yes, I think that's a lot of the reason. The other thing that we often struggle with is how do you provide what I would describe as like cognizable transparency, the markers that are useful and helpful. One of the interesting challenges is how do you quantify the impact of an information operation? We often get people who say, we'd just like to know the total of the number of accounts you've taken down for engaging in I.O. And the problem with a statistic like that, there's a number of things. First is, if we take down millions of fake accounts every day, the vast majority of those don't engage in I.O. A tiny minority of them probably do. And if we're moving at that speed, we're not going to know, which means we're either going to drastically underreport or drastically overreport the number of accounts. But more than that, there's two takedowns I always use for this. One takedown involved a single event. It was in July of last year. It was an event that was inviting people to come out into the street and counter-protest the No Unite the Right To movement. And the idea was to get people on the street, potentially to get into a fight with people they disagreed with. Then we had another takedown that involved 200 and something pages with 40 million followers that were running networks of deception for months and months and months. And the question I would ask you is, which of those is worse by the numbers? One is a single event with the potential for physical harm. The other is long-term sort of social implications, but nothing physical in the real world. The numbers just don't tell the right story. And so I think a big part of the problem, and one of the things we've talked to Atlantic Council and others about, is how do we come up with a consistent model so that on every takedown we can all say, or every action, here's what it is, here's what happened, and here's the comparable statistics that help people do that measurement.
Yeah, Clara, what would you say success in this space looks like?
Yeah, I think success depends on the audience, right? I think in this community, in the open source community, it really comes down, in my opinion, around consistency and how we think about how to measure, how we put data out, and what is actually valuable. And I think that's a very different segment than when you think about the pressure that's coming from policymakers, what they want as statistics to show success that they are doing the right thing to push against particular malicious actors. And I think that's also very, very different from what typical users of most of these platforms think of, right? And they may not necessarily even understand the optics of why something is being taken down and why it stays up. So I think those are very different narratives that, unfortunately, for all professionals in this space, you have to figure out very specific ways of educating and also describing. I think the biggest success is if we could have that layer of a spam filter that most people don't even have to think about for the general public. That is there, and so the second they see something that looks like, a Nigerian prince asking you for $10 million, you know to actually weed it out of your head. But there's a layer of sophisticated analysts that have weeded out, the basis of particular malicious content, months in advance, and created the right algorithms for detection, things like that.
It makes me think, because I think one of the big challenges with transparency here is transparency about what? definitions are really hard in this space. Simple example among the platforms, the way we define information operations, the way Twitter defines information operations, the way Google define them, may all be slightly different, which means if we're disclosing what we consider to be information operations, these aren't necessarily comparable sets. And if you get a group of 10 experts in the room and you ask them to define I/O, you're going to get like 12 different definitions. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because the truth is this space is so new and evolving. Obviously, information operations have been around for a very long time, but the current manifestation of them, it just means that as these things change, the quantification and transparency of them gets really challenging because the meaning changes so quickly.
And I did want to add to that point. We're seeing more and more new players come in. Nathaniel mentioned this earlier. There's a number of cybersecurity companies that are coming into the fold. So you have folks like FireEye, you have folks like CrowdStrike, and they've done a lot of really good work working with a number of the major platforms around identifying campaigns. There's a PR push behind it, and there's been strong reaction from the platforms in some cases. At the same time, there's also newer players like Symantec, and there's also players that may not have the right analytic methods before they publish out a report. And this is a space where it becomes really dangerous when journalists suddenly see something that's pushed out by a company that may have credibility in a different space, but is new to information operations and starts trying to do work without consulting the rest of the professionals in the industry. So I did want to add to that point, because that is really dangerous. We're going to end up creating a lot more misunderstandings in the space, and that's going to confuse the rest of the audience that are not here in this room today.
So you're absolutely right, and this is a really interesting point. One of the things that we know, and I suspect you guys have seen, this plays into the manipulating public perception point. We know that a key part of the offense-dominant strategy of a number of actors in this space is to make themselves appear bigger than they really are. They want everyone to think they are everywhere and they control everything. And so one of the interesting challenges and things that we struggle with a lot, which feeds into this, is often when we do a takedown, that moment when we announce it and we talk to the press about it is the most attention that takedown ever got. Now, it's really important that people understand the techniques that are being used, but at the same time, we're sort of playing into the hands of the adversaries. And I think the worst way to do that and the easiest way to do that is to jump and see everything as a foreign government, right? Everything as a massive, sophisticated, complex, and impactful operation. Because the truth is a lot of these aren't. A lot of them are really interesting. A lot of them it's really important to deal with. But if we play them up too much, we end up literally playing into the hands of these actors. And one of the ways I know this is we see repeatedly actors will run an operation, and the goal is to try to get coverage of it. Because coverage is the best way they amplify their story. And so how do we cover it while still and expose the operation without playing into their hands? I think that's a really hard challenge, and it's one of the things that we're thinking a lot about, particularly over the course of the next 6 months and the next year. How can the platforms, civil society, and the media think about how do we raise awareness about this without playing into that trap?
And I also wanted to add a different point to this. Go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, no. So, prior to foreign influence operations, I was focused on terrorist content online. We're seeing a lot of trends in this space where content actually spreads into other forms of online harm. So, for example, Louisiana chemical attacks back in 2014, you had the IRA pretending to be ISIS. And that becomes a very different segment of researchers that you have to engage to really determine credibility. And sometimes you have professionals that have the experience and background in both fields. Sometimes you don't. And that's also another space where we also see a lot of media amplifying when they see something pushed out that claims to be by a particular actor. So.
Yeah, I'm not going to take the blame for the entire media problems, but there are definitely things that can be addressed, and that the media definitely needs to be doing better in terms of responding to these and sort of educating and informing the public as well. And to move into, I guess, actually to slightly backtrack onto that point of the standards of what we consider these campaigns, if you want to call them campaigns, is always changing. The definitions are always alternating. Are you having those conversations with the other big platforms about creating standard definitions or groups that are looking at this within yourselves?
Yes, we're having those conversations, and not just with other platforms. We actually do a lot of this with civil society representatives and people who are thinking about this from outside the company. The truth is, because the platforms are all a little bit different, or maybe a lot different, the definitions we have are not always going to be the same. And it's not clear to me that they should be, right? So we have our definition of coordinated inauthentic behavior, and Olga's going to talk a bit more about that in detail. That's when we see that, we're going to take broad action against it because we see a group of assets coordinating to mislead the public. Other platforms, whether it's a YouTube or a Twitter, they have a different ecosystem, which means the nature of threats they see are going to be different. So the policy that they define is going to look different and probably should be different. However, I think there are a set of definitions that if you pull back, what is an information operation? What is coordinated deception? Those definitions, I think a lot of the definitions we use today, and again, mis and disinformations are great examples of this, are rooted in a long tradition of this space that has radically changed in the last 5 years, and how we get consistent definitions, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. And those, in terms of those conversations, like, what's actually happened in terms of, like, are you making them? Like,
yeah,
is there tangible results? Is the question.
Right, so fair enough. So I've had a whole series of conversations with colleagues at a number of these companies. Often what happens is the conversation, there's two versions of the conversation. One is we have ongoing strategic conversations. What are the threats that you're seeing? What are the definitions that you're using? How do those affect? We do a lot of tactical collaboration. I've seen this threat. Do you see that? Here's some information I have. And one of the best examples of this, we did some takedowns involving content emanating from Iran earlier this year. And it was interesting. Last year we did this. We saw some stuff, we took it down. Twitter saw what we'd taken down, used that. They found some stuff and took it down. We saw what they did, used that, and we had this back and forth. And we learned from that. And this year we did a pretty major takedown where we did a lot of that before the announcements. And we were able to find more, and they were able to find more because we were comparing notes. We have that tactical collaboration. We have the broader strategic collaboration. And then around specific hard questions. What is, and here's a great buzzword for today, manipulated media? How do we define that and think about that? We have deeper conversations, particularly about those definitions, to understand what we're all seeing and how we can tackle it.
And I'm going to open to questions from the floor and from the app in like a couple of minutes. But before we get to there, who do you think should be liable for these issues? Should it be the companies? Should it's difficult because they're not generating the content, and it comes into that discussions that has been ongoing a long time about publishers and whether companies are publishers in that respect. But who should be liable, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can answer that problem, I would be God, right? You know, so I think a lot of the problems that people don't see is U.S. obviously has a lot of these major social media platforms, and really in terms of legal liability, you have the Communications Decency Act of 1996 that states, Section 230 states that platforms are an intermediary and that they are not liable for third-party content. And so when it comes to building incentive in the platform side, it's really, really hard because there is no legal there's no law in place that actually enforces them to have to act. And that's also why we're seeing more and more governments around the world trying to think about policies against online content, because it's been this very, very gray area space. And this is a little bit different around how other types of media are moderated online. When it comes to journalists and media publications, there is much more rigor and discipline. And so I think that's a really, really big question. And I joke around, but I say, you know, today, it's like in the email age, if you were to get an email from a Nigerian prince asking for that $10,000 because you're going to get $1 million in return, and you suddenly decide to bash AOL or Gmail or Symantec to say, why didn't you prevent me from sending this money to this Nigerian prince, right? I think it's really, really hard for most people to see the rest of the ecosystem of the players involved beyond the platforms. And so a lot of the public dialogue has been just a blame game of this is this entity's fault or this is that entity's fault. And in order for us to really solve this problem at scale, we need the rest of the community, the rest of the users, the rest of the world to really understand the complexity. And without that, it's really, really hard for us to solve this.
And the role of like civil society in coming up with those questions, because with the greatest respect, none of the big platforms are going to be particularly positive to be or proactive in saying regulate us. I know obviously Mark has said that on some cases, but like does a lot of this energy need to come from civil society and other groups in terms of redefining these conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there needs to be pressure coming from all sides, but there also needs to be organized pressure, right? If we're not organized in any way, if the professional community isn't organized around standards for terms, if the policy side is not organized in policies that they choose to enact, then you don't have anything that's enforceable. It just wastes everyone's time responding to requests, and it doesn't really solve the operational problem. at hand.
It's interesting. Every time I have this conversation, I think I'm reminded some years ago I was at the Internet Governance Forum, sort of the global gathering of people talking about these challenges online and how you regulate this space. And I remember that a representative of one of the major tech platforms stood up, it wasn't Facebook, it was one of the others at the time, and said to the government representatives here, we make more decisions every day on free speech than you guys do in freedom of expression. Please take this power away from us. It was this like appeal for regulation. And the interesting thing about this memory is that was in 2009. So I think we have said pretty clearly we think there should be regulation, and we really do. And I think the reason we think that is in a space like this, rules are really important. And when you don't have rules, it becomes really easy for people to try to work the ref. And so having those guidelines is really critical. And that's not something that we can come up with. It shouldn't be. I think the interesting question, though, is how do you hold different organizations responsible for the piece of the puzzle that they can solve? I think we have a critical responsibility for making sure that the platform, that our platform, is as supportive of authenticity as possible. And it makes it much harder for there to be deception on the platform. And so Mark and we have talked about understanding the prevalence of deception on the platform and us working to drive that down and that being a mechanism. At the same time, I will say, the protections that 230 provides are actually really critical to having open public debate. When you remove those, the natural consequence is to over-remove content, and you're going to end up silencing a lot of speech. And I think that's a really difficult tension. And I think one piece that I would really love to see more discussion of also is the actors who engage in this. Now, let's set aside the foreign actors. That's a very serious challenge. There's a lot of work to be done there. But as we see more and more domestic actors and other actors pushing these boundaries, how do we articulate what their responsibilities are as well? So I think there's responsibility on everyone. I think we should take, and we do take, a burden of that. And I think there should be regulation to enforce and draw those lines.
Okay, I'm going to open up the floor to any questions. I think there's a mic, and we'll have the app as well. There's instantly seen a hand at the back there, if there is a mic.
Now I will slowly rotate around. A couple there.
While we're waiting for a microphone, let's take one off the off the screen to begin with. So in terms of let's take the second one because that's probably the most juicy. So what is Facebook's reasoning for stopping work with Huawei? What's the threat in that sort of space?
Sure. So I think we follow when you see the government take a particular action to designate an organization in that way, we follow that action. This is one of these spaces where we are not an intelligence organization, we're a private company. We need to learn from and follow some of the work in that space. This is why partnerships with government are so important. When we talk about, as an example, this is slightly different, but I think closely related. When we talk about attributing to threat actors, we often don't have the information to meaningfully attribute to who's behind something. We can see the country they come from, the type of operation, but we can't see who did it or why. The times when we have been able to do that is often when we have some kind of tip from law enforcement. So this is a case where having that kind of signaling is really important, and then we can build on that.
Okay, great. In terms of questions, there was, at the back over there, the lady with the hand.
Mic coming up.
Yeah, there we go. Cheers.
Around.
Thank you very much for the.
Oh, sorry. Could you just stand up and say where you're from as well, just so we can all.
Well, I'm a BBC journalist covering Eastern Europe and focused on disinformation. My name is Olga, and my question is to the Nathaniel, if possible. While many messengers currently use encryption, is Facebook planning to? Because it is extremely popular in Eastern Europe, where there are many problems with intelligence services which are trying to catch conversations. And it is not used, and lots of messengers do use it. And what is wrong with Facebook? Why don't you? And are there any plans to? Thanks.
Sure. So WhatsApp is an encrypted messaging platform. For Facebook Messenger, we actually recently announced that we're moving towards an encrypted messaging platform for Messenger as well and for messages. The explicit goal for that is because we see people who want that encrypted space to communicate in. We see the very clear safety and security benefits that provides. We also recognize that encryption can provide challenges when you're doing safety investigations. And so part of what we've said is, I think we've actually already consulted with some of the people here in the room, but we're going to have a range of engagements as we think about how do we move towards broad encrypted messaging, which is already available in Messenger, but moving to make it more of a default and more broadly available, and think about the consequences of that and do it in the right way. But absolutely, I completely agree.
Cool, fantastic. To go over this side, the gentleman with a hand up just over here.
Thanks. I'm a journalist from Armenia studying at LSE now. My question is about policy changes, actually. Recently, a lot of, especially European countries, have decided to change the laws about regulations. And especially in Germany, for instance, there is a law now which makes you to tackle the harmful content on your platforms. And actually, after this law, 3 out of 6 moderators of Facebook started working in Germany, which means that you were pushed to do this change, but you didn't do that before. And now France has different law, and UK has this white paper. I'm sure you know about it. What do you think about these changes that makes you to tackle issues, and why you don't do it without this push from these states, from governments? And if it's possible to have like moderators in Germany, so many moderators there, why do you don't have them in other countries? Why there is a need for a law to have this?
So we have moderators actually spread in a bunch of different places around the world, and they work globally. The question is where we can do the best sourcing to respond quickly. I would say the law in Germany, there's been discussion of law in France and in other places. We've been working as closely as we can with the different governments in Europe and elsewhere around the world to try to figure out how to make the laws as effective as possible. And I think it's really encouraging to see all of that discussion. I think there's other places where we see laws that are being considered that really are motivated to enable governments to have more control of what shows up on these platforms and what doesn't. Those are pretty concerning. And the question is how you strike a balance between these.
And actually, to pick up on one of the questions on the screen here, the bottom one, Facebook recently, I think it was over this weekend or at the beginning of this week, dropped graph search. What were the reasons behind that, and in particularly with views to open source investigations? That seems to be limiting sort of.
It's a really good question. I mean, it's exactly why I said earlier we've seen this tension. I've seen multiple cases this year where this exact thing happened, where we saw a tool that was used by the open source community to conduct investigations being used by threat actors to do pretty dangerous and malicious things to users on the platform. And so when we see that, we have to close the loophole, because the threat of physical harm and the threats of these harms is something we can't ignore. But it also means that the tools that are available for a critical community like this get weaker, and that's a real problem, which is why part of what we're doing is working with the community here to think through what can we provide back to enable that type of search. Maybe we can do it through an API framework where we can understand who's using it and who isn't, to ensure that the good actors, the researchers who are using it in a safe and an effective and a productive and public way are using it, and have a better sense that we're preventing the types of harms that we've seen. It's a really difficult balance, though, and there isn't an easy answer to this. I think for us, we need to move much more quickly, not just in closing loopholes that threat actors might be exploiting, but in ensuring that if we have to close a loophole because of risk, we figure out how to open access to do more investigations in a safer and more sort of secure way.
So we're not going to see graph search come back when you've looked at some of those things, or is it a case of you're going to create a new tool that's provided to a community? So
the capability provided by it is something that we're looking at exactly right now to figure out how can we provide it in a way that is safe and secure. That's definitely something that we're trying to figure out.
And Clara, on that, do you think that these sorts of tools, like what needs to be done with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to throw in a plug here. There's a tool called the Information Operations Archive that's built by the German Marshall Fund and also Graphica. And it takes all the data sets for disinformation that researchers, that companies have released, and allows researchers to be able to engage and look at analytics a little bit like graph search. But I think one of the problems is really consistency in how data can be released in a way that researchers don't have to spend that much time manipulating that data to be usable. At the same time, I think a lot of companies are grappling with some of the legal repercussions alongside how do you keep this data secure from particular actors that might use this as a means to further manipulate. So it's this struggle and balance that's very hard.
Okay, let's jump to a question down here.
I don't. Oh, it is on. Sophia Mateos, I'm Facebook editor for Deutsche Welle. I have a couple of questions, a philosophical one and a more practical one. How do you reconcile the fact that the platforms are designed for addiction with the adversarial design concept that you have in mind? My second one is, how do you counter the effect of fake news? I've been working on this for 5 years now. I've seen friends get push notifications to say, I was the target of blah, blah, blah. I saw this ad, and yet you're telling me that you can't quantify the impact of it, when if I go on my page, I can tell you how many seconds of each video my users have done, and you can, and at times, strike down my ads because they are too political. So how is it that you can quantify so much what I spend on my page and you can't quantify what these people are spending on?
Sure. So 2 questions. First the philosophical one, then the practical one. From a philosophical perspective, what I would say is if we want to build a platform that people want to spend time on, we actually don't want to design for addiction. We want to design for a positive experience. And we consistently see that if you build a platform that enables a lot of clickbait and a lot of low-quality content, if you want something that's going to last a very short period of time, you might get people onto the platform. But if you're building an environment that people want to spend time over a long period of time, it doesn't work. Advertisers don't want to be on the platform. Users don't want to be on the platform. So one of the things that's interesting here is I actually think the incentive of the companies to tackle this problem is very closely aligned to the incentive of society to have this problem dealt with, which I think is really critical. So that's the first point. The second point is how do you counter this sort of challenge of deceptive narrative? And I would say the principle of adversarial design is a really important part of this. Deceptive narratives, information operations, have been around for generations. They're a lot more effective and they're a lot more visible today because people are using a new medium to amplify and drive this messaging. But we've seen very consistently that you can change the medium to make that type of deception harder. And you can do that by making it harder to run networks of fake accounts. You can do that by providing more context so that people can see the things that are false and deceptive or aren't. And we've implemented a number of these steps, and we've seen that impact. When I was talking about the quantification point, I think what I meant there was it's really hard to compare, say, numbers of accounts and get a score of this is more problematic or that is more problematic, because accounts, if used in different ways, can be problematic to different degrees. But I do think over time, you can make manipulation and deception on these platforms much more difficult and much more expensive. And you drive back towards the environment we've had where there has always been, people who try to be deceptive in public debate. The trick is to make it expensive and difficult enough that it's not a weapon of first resort, right? That it's a much weaker tool.
And I actually did want to add to that point around addiction. Who are the other amplifiers of deceptive content, right? What happens when they're journalists? What happens when they're public figures? Who is responsible in those cases? And should platforms spend more time specifically focused on taking down an account with 4,000 followers, or maybe helping educate particular amplifiers that might be broadcasting that to millions, right? So that's a really grappling and interesting question that also is around addiction.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. Is there a question sort of over this side as well? At the lady down there.
Hi, I'm Sarah Andrew from Avaz. Local question. The UK are introducing a bill to give services like Facebook a duty of care towards their users. They will have powers to fine and even block content. Do you think that disinformation should be part of the bucket of harms that regulator looks after?
So it's an interesting question. The first thing that I would say is it probably depends a little bit on how you define disinformation. This is where the definitions are so important. Generally, I think we've worked with the UK government, we've worked with other governments that are trying to create some kind of oversight capacity. I think a mechanism for oversight is good and important, and I think that it makes sense for, whether you call it information operations or misinformation, whatever the tool is, for that to be part of the discussion. Yes. I think that this space is particularly challenging because what constitutes a false statement is a very, very tricky determination to make in a democratic society. And having any one institution figure that out can be really challenging and risks resulting. I think one of the things that is challenging in this space is that sometimes I think we risk confusing bugs with features. So a lot of the mechanisms that enable broad public debate are the very same mechanisms that we see threat actors exploiting to drive manipulation and disinformation. But that doesn't mean we should close the mechanisms that enable broad public debate, because often what they're doing is they're bringing out discussions, really critical discussions, that might never have happened in a world where we had more constraint and control who got to decide what was said. The real question is, how can we continue to enable the broad public discussion and the voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard while still tackling the challenge of, let's call it false narratives, information operations? But I mean, I think, yes, it should be considered. I think the question is how you do it.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. So thank you very much for joining us both here. And please join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you, guys.